Morning.
My pleasure, Honour. I call Alistair Polkinghorne. If Mr Polkinghorne could come forward, please.
Silence, please. Do you solemnly and sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence you shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, please say, I do.
I do.
Have a seat. Thanks, Mr Polkinghorne.
Mr Polkinghorne, would you please state your full name, your present occupation and your professional address, please?
It's Alistair Blake Polkinghorne. My occupation is a pilot consultant, and my address is 10 Elmsford Place in Curtin in the ACT.
And have you prepared a report in relation to the deaths of Rick De Morgan Jr., Paul Hudson and Ian Macbeth, dated the 14th of March 2023?
Yes, I have.
And do you adhere to the opinions that you've expressed therein?
Yes.
You've set out in your report a summary of your expertise and a short curriculum vitae. In brief terms, I understand that you're type rated to a Boeing 737 and a number of other aircraft that you've identified in your report, but you have experience in flying more than 40 different models of aircraft, is that right? Does that include a Hercules or a Lockheed Martin C-130?
Doesn't include a Hercules.
Do you know much about the capabilities or limitations of a C-130 Hercules or not?
I'm familiar with their role in both military and firebombing operations.
You then set out in your background information that you have approximately 11,000 hours of aeronautical experience, including approximately 1,800 hours in the low-level environment, and that's below 300 feet AGL, correct? Can you just elaborate in relation to those 1,800 hours in that low-level operating environment, what you're actually undertaking?
The various types of work there, some of that is aerial mustering, some of that is aerial applications, so spraying and spreading fertiliser. Some of it is doing flight validation work on navigation aids around Australia and nearby islands. So last year I spent a couple of months spraying.
You then mentioned that you have over 5,000 hours in multi-crew turbine operations. Again, could you just briefly explain that experience for her?
Okay, so that's experience in Australia, Malaysia and India, flying multi-crew regular public transport aircraft. Currently, I'm on the staff of Link Airways in Canberra, where I fly a Saab, a Metroliner and a Conquest, all in multi-crew operations. I also do a number of single pilot operations as well. I'm a trainer on all of those aircraft and a checker on all of those aircraft.
Thank you. Now, just coming to your experience, what, if any, experience do you have in relation to aerial firefighting? Have you ever performed any role in relation to aerial firefighting, whether it be in the air or in some capacity on the ground?
No role.
Right. At all?
At all. I've done some consulting work in aerial firefighting operations and contracts and procedures, but no actual sitting in an aeroplane in aerial firefighting roles.
Have you ever been on an air desk or been an air operations manager or an air attack supervisor or any of those roles? Thank you. Now, have you watched any of the evidence that has been called this week before Her Honour?
No.
Have you seen some evidence relating to Sean Dugan, Captain Dugan, who was the pilot of Bomber B-13?
I've read the evidence yesterday.
And having read that evidence of Captain Dugan, does that in any way change the opinions you've expressed?
No.
Do you have a copy of your report with you,
Yes.
Mr Polkinghorne? I just want to work through it methodically, if I may. dealing firstly with question 1, which is page 4 of your report, page 2342 of the brief of evidence, Your Honour, it's volume 8, tab 132. Just want to ask you about the notation within the NAFC about aviation is a highly visible asset with strong political influences. You've recorded that at different places in the report. What, if any, significance does that have in relation, in your opinion, to the tasking of large air tankers within the New South Wales Rural Fire Service?
I think it builds the expectation that when there's a major event, those aircraft will be deployed, and it's politically expedient to do so, and comes at a political cost not to do so.
And what, if anything, in your opinion, do you have to say about that notion of those assets being highly visible with a strong political influence in relation to safety, in particular air safety?
I think it gets back to the issue that there's a very strong cultural feeling that when there's a fire, these assets should be deployed, and they should be deployed for as long as possible, and until the fire's either under control or it becomes absolutely untenable. So there's I mean, I can see a problem coming here with wanting to deploy the assets and safety on the other point. So you want the assets deployed up until the point that it becomes unsafe. And you know, if there's a huge margin between deploying the assets and it becoming unsafe, there's political noise in that space.
Well, if we can just unpack that answer, firstly, you talk of that political imperative that may make flying operations unsafe, but as you have readily identified in your report, that ultimately the responsibility as to whether or not an aircraft accepts or rejects a task rests with the pilot in command.
That's right.
So in those circumstances, how would that bear upon, in your opinion, the decision-making of a pilot in command whether to accept or reject a particular tasking?
Look, I think there's strong cultural factors that build into the pilots the fact that they go flying when there's an emergency on, and I think there's probably an overt expectation that they deploy when they're requested, and I think they probably feel they need to continue until the point that they feel it's absolutely unsafe not to continue.
What do you base that opinion on, Mr. Polkinghorn, in circumstances where you haven't worked within an aerial firefighting operation? You speak of culture and you've used the word culture twice. What do you base that opinion on?
Of various other types of operations that have an emergency nature, which even other aerial tasks that occur. If you're a pilot, you're expected to go flying, and the only time you don't go flying is when the weather's too bad, or the aircraft's not right, or you know, there's got to be something that makes it unsafe for you to say, well, we don't want to go flying.
And if those integers were present, notwithstanding the political imperative or the cultural workings within an organisation to put pressure on a pilot, ultimately the pilot, if apprised of all relevant information, should be making a decision as to whether or not he or she should fly, correct?
That's right.
You've identified the objects of the Rural Fires Act and identify the coordination of firefighting and the need to prevent fires in New South Wales through the use of aerial firefighting assets. Do you accept that New South Wales Rural Fire Service also has an obligation to ensure that those aerial firefighting assets are deployed in a safe manner?
Well, it's not in the objects of the Act as far as I can see.
Well, what about if we take a broad construction of Section 3C, where the New South Wales Rural Fire Service is to protect persons from injury or death arising from fires?
You could broadly interpret it like that.
Do you accept that the New South Wales Rural Fire Service has a system in place to assist pilots in command undertake their tasks for aerial firefighting activities?
Can you run that again?
From your review of the evidence before Her Honour, do you agree with me that there was a system in place within the New South Wales Rural Fire Service, firstly for the tasking of large air tankers, right? And that tasking rested with the State Operations Controller?
Yes.
And that when a decision had been made by the State Operations Controller to task a large air tanker, the logistical coordination, that is the implementation of that tasking, went through a number of channels. It went via the State Air Desk, correct? Went to the Air Base Manager at Richmond, who then had communications with the pilot or the crew of a particular LAT.
Yes.
And that when that particular LAT's inbound to a fire ground, that there may be communications between that LAT and a local air operations manager or aviation radio operator.
Yes.
Accept that? Yes. Do you agree that that would be a system ordinarily described?
Yes.
Now, in circumstances where New South Wales Rural Fire Service has a system to assist pilots in command to undertake their deployment in relation to retardant drops, would you agree with me that it's important that that system operates in a way that ensures the safety of all people involved in that system?
I think the sentiment is fine. I think the reality of it is that the people in the system are not equipped to pick the points where it becomes safe or unsafe in that system. And I think that very correctly belongs with the pilot in command to make the call on that one.
And would you agree with me that in circumstances where that ultimate decision-making rests with a pilot in command as to whether or not he or she will accept a tasking, is predicated on them being provided with all relevant and critical information?
Their decision-making has got to be based on the information they choose to look at, and I don't see an obligation with the Rural Fire Service to furnish them with all the particular bits of information that may be relevant to their flight. So there are various other sources of information which we routinely use when before you go flying, and the Rural Fire Service is not the only channel. It may be a channel, but I don't see an obligation for the Rural Fire Service to provide the exhaustive channel of say, weather information in this instance.
What about, for example, the RFS providing information in relation to local flying conditions at a particular fire ground that a pilot might be tasked to?
It may be helpful, but there'll be a microclimate associated with each location, and it's probably varying rapidly with a fire at the location. So it may be helpful, but does it change the decision making? It probably assists in the decision making, but it may not be a yes or no. You know, it's not a black and white answer as a result of that information.
I'm not suggesting it is, but if one stands back and looks at a risk assessment process, which a pilot ought to be making regularly throughout the course of a flight, correct? Is that, would you agree with me that the more information you have in relation to environmental conditions, operating conditions, may be relevant to assist in that risk assessment process?
It may be relevant. But
and you won't, and you won't know until the information's been relayed to you as to whether or not it's relevant or not.
I mean, you're not going to know if it's relevant or not unless it's relayed to you. There is a danger that there's so much information that the essential, the gems of information are among the gravel, and it's just how much gravel you've got to find the gems of information that you need.
You've had an opportunity to consider the ATSB final report in relation to this particular incident. At page 50 of that report, it's page 276 of Your Honour's brief of evidence, the following passages are recorded, Mr Polkinghorn, by the ATSB, and it says this, and I'm happy if you've got it handy to turn it up, but it says this: at interview, mixed responses were received from pilots regarding their expectations on task rejections. All were consistent in that there was a need to be informed of and the reason for the rejection decision, so this could be factored into their decision making in line with their company policies and procedures. Now, do you agree with that proposition that's recorded there or not?
Well, I don't know that I disagree or agree.
Right. Well, do you hold a view as to whether it would be reasonable or unreasonable for pilots undertaking aerial firefighting activities to have an expectation that they would be informed of the reason why a task, that is an aerial firefighting task, was rejected by a colleague?
There's a wide variety of reasons why they'd be rejected. I think there are some instances where it is relevant, and I think there are some instances where it's irrelevant. I think the culture that it builds, the potential for building a culture of a particular pilot being known to reject tasks or continue on tasks would be seen by both the contractors and the Rural Fire Services as differentiating pilots. So we send a particular pilot on a particular job. So I don't know that it's a healthy cultural practice.
Well, coming back to my question, if I may, do you hold the view that whether it would be reasonable or unreasonable for a pilot who's being tasked to undertake aerial firefighting activities to be informed of the reason why a particular pilot may have rejected a task?
I don't think it's a healthy cultural practice.
And do I take it then that you don't necessarily agree that being informed of the reason why a pilot has rejected a task, that could be factored into the decision-making process whether to accept or reject a task as the individual
I think
pilot?
there's situations where it's appropriate, and I think there's situations where it's inappropriate. For a situation where it's a completely different aircraft, and it may be a different fire ground as well. There are many bits around this. I mean, if the pilots talk amongst themselves and say, "Well, I've not gone to this job because of a particular reason," I think that's a healthy and reasonable cultural practice. I don't think it's necessarily healthy for the information to be in the wider public domain on a day-to-day basis, because pilots will be differentiated because of their ability to accept or reject a task.
Right, well, if you assume that on the 23rd of January 2020, all local aerial assets based out of the Cooma Fire Control Centre were grounded,
Yes.
in consultation with senior pilots and the IMT because of strong winds and poor visibility.
Yes.
You then further assume, please, Mr. Polkinghorne, that the grounding of those crews may have been notified to LAT pilots, but not the reason why. Now, based on those assumptions, in that scenario, would it not be reasonable for a pilot in command to receive the reason why local aircrew are not flying, so they can consider that as part of their pre-flight risk assessment or their in-flight risk assessment?
I don't think I can comment because I don't know how many crews were there that were grounded.
Let's assume 2, a low number.
Okay.
Why would that not be relevant information for a pilot to assess whether or not they accept a task or continue with a task?
It may be relevant information.
And that's all I'm asking, Mr. Polkinghorne. But that information, it ultimately rests in the pilot in command as to whether it's relevant to them or not in their decision-making process, correct?
Yes.
And if it's provided to them, it may be of some assistance to them or not. Yes. But at least they've been provided with it. Yes. Again, page 50 of the ATSB report, it's recorded. Others stated, that's referring to pilots, that a weather-related rejection should result in cancellation of the tasking. Now, what view, if any, do you have in relation to that topic?
My view is that the decision to terminate or continue a task lives with the pilot in command. I mean, in this instance that you're talking about, the 7-3 had turned around and come back. It's entirely reasonable that the pilot in command of Bomber 134 said, well, that's a very different type of aircraft than the one I'm flying, and chose to continue based on the fact that it's a very different aircraft.
Moving to the next part of that same paragraph, it's recorded that the operator indicated that while a bird dog, and you understand what a bird dog is, can provide valuable risk mitigations when the pilot in command is initial attack trained, they do not consider it to be a requirement. Do you have a view on that matter or not?
No.
The report goes on to say, however, for a tasking without the bird dog, the reason for this would need to be factored into the pilot in command's pre-flight planning. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I don't think I have an opinion on that.
And why is that?
Because there's so many factors that would influence the decision there.
You've not ever undertaken the role of a bird dog pilot or been in a lead plane as an air attack supervisor, I take it?
That's right.
Would you agree with me that the bird dog, from your experience or knowledge, is a much smaller plane?
Yes.
More manoeuvrable? Yes. At low level?
Yes. And
can be used as a reconnaissance by doing a number of circuits before deciding whether or not a retardant drop should occur or not?
Yes.
In circumstances where you don't have a bird dog that can undertake that aerial reconnaissance and provide intelligence back to the pilot in command, why do you say that that may not be relevant information to a pilot in command if a bird dog is not going to be there because of poor weather, for example, flying weather?
Well, in this instance, the bird dog had gone home already.
Just assume, in the hypothetical, that a bird dog declines a task because the flying conditions are unfavourable and visibility is poor. If that decision has been made by a lead pilot, who's going to lead in an LAT ordinarily, would it not be relevant information to the pilot in command as to why the bird dog has declined the task?
It's a piece of information that may be used by the pilot.
Page 57 of the ATSB final report, the last paragraph, Mr. Polkinghorne records this, and I'll just read it back to you in full. While known to RFS personnel, it was very unlikely that the crew of B134 were aware that the bird dog pilot had rejected the tasking or that the smaller fire control aircraft were no longer operating in the area due to hazardous environmental conditions. While this was only one risk factor among others that would be considered by the crew, having this information would have allowed them to make a more informed decision about the weather conditions and the task acceptance. Do you agree or disagree with that proposition?
That proposition has some merit.
And why do you say that?
Because it gives an indication that a number of pilots have made a decision not to continue. However, the exact location, the pilot in command of 134 may have made the decision that things might be different where they were going. And, as I said earlier, there's microclimates surrounding these particular places. They're some, 40 miles apart or something like that. So it may be that there was an expectation that the weather conditions would be slightly different at the other location.
Can I take you back into your report, please, to page 7, page 2345 of your Honours version, to about halfway into that page, Mr. Polkinghorne, it's paragraph 1.2.19. You state there, as agencies have had easier access to greater levels of information, this relates to the morning briefing. What's the greater levels of information are you referring to that the agency, and let's assume you're referring to RFS, has access to?
In their operations room, they've got feeds from all sorts of sources. They've got Bureau of Met feeds, they've got news feeds, they've got, it's basically a newsroom, but it's an operations centre. So there are multiple feeds of information coming into that room.
And in circumstances where the tasking agency has access to greater levels of information, do you see any detriment in providing some of that access to pilots in command to help us assist them in relation to whether they accept or reject the tasking?
There's, I think the issue is the agencies serving up all the information. So the pilots are swamped with information. And it's the same analogy that I used earlier. There's a few gems of information in there which are really pertinent to decision making. But unfortunately, it's hidden in a bucket of gravel. And they've got to pick through pick through the gravel to find the gems.
If there was a role that coordinated large air tankers, let's call it a LATCO, large air tanker coordinator, if that person was a direct point of contact for a pilot in command, do you see that being beneficial in terms of the direct flow of important information between pilot in command and someone responsible for coordinating the tasking?
That would be a way of getting information, yes.
And that direct line of communication, one would hope, cuts out any knowledge gaps that may have occurred through different chains of command, or, as you've referred to in your report, mitigate the Chinese whispers effect, because the pilot can go straight to a central repository of information.
It might be one way of achieving the result. There are various other ways of achieving the same result.
All right. Could you please elaborate?
Where the responsibility lays is an issue here. I think it may come through the LAT operator. So the LAT operator may be providing the information or assisting the pilot in getting the relevant information that's pertinent to the safety of their flight. So it would separate the tasking function to the safety function. So while your LATCO may provide that, I think it perhaps greys the boundaries of responsibility.
Let's assume the responsibility as to whether a pilot accepts or rejects the task lays with the pilot,
yes,
but that the lines of communication are being opened up so that the pilot can receive as much information as they deem relevant to allow them to form an opinion as to whether or not they accept or reject a task.
Well, it's a reasonable proposition, but I think the responsibility for providing the information lays with the operator to the pilot, as distinct from the client to the pilot. So if LATCO lives in the client, the agency being the client, in the client domain,
Thank you. That's a very
I think
good
we've got a
point.
problem there.
You have a
Problem there.
Well, let's assume that the LATCO would sit on the State Air Desk, out of State Operations Command within the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. Why would you have a problem with that?
Because some of that function belongs with the operator as distinct from the client. It's not the role of the client to provide the operational information that people are making safety decisions about to the operator.
If the arrangement works on the basis that the client, being the RFS, I assume is who you're referring to, Mr. Polkinghorn, that they will be provided with large air tankers or very large air tankers to undertake aerial firefighting services, and that there would be a sum involved for the use of those assets, and that the system as it exists works on the basis that the client RFS will provide job dispatches or taskings to particular LAT pilots, and within that tasking there would be coordinates,
Yes.
Radio frequencies, and various information that a pilot would need to undertake the tasking. Why then do you have a problem with the RFS providing that type of information to a pilot or to the pilot's principal, being Coulson Aviation in this example?
The responsibility for operating the aircraft lives with the operator, not the client. That's one reason, and the other one is that the information may get subtly changed to facilitate the aircraft flying and the pilot making decisions that are not in their best interests.
But all I'm suggesting to you, Mr. Polkinghorne, that there be a central person that is the LATCO on a state air desk who can provide information relevant to a pilot in command's decision making, whether to accept or reject a task. And I'm struggling to understand why you're adverse to that idea when it's just the information flow of information directly from a central repository.
Because I think the flow of information about whether to start, continue, or terminate a flight,
like I said, let's assume it still rests with the pilot, right? That responsibility remains with the pilot.
Yes,
right.
But there are some operator type functions here as well. I think that if LATCO lived with the operator, that would be a reasonable way to organise it. But the delineation between the client and the operator needs to be absolute where the responsibilities lay. And I don't believe that the client getting into the space of providing operational information to the contractor is a reasonable way to set up a system.
All right. Well, then how does the pilot obtain quickly and easily information that's coming from the fire ground where they may be required to do a retardant drop? How do you suggest that work? Which is, let's assume that is crucial information to a pilot. They want to know what's happening on the ground, what the local environmental conditions are, whether there's any hazards, whether it be a communication tower or whatever. How do they get that information quickly and easily if they don't get it from someone within the client, namely the RFS?
I don't have a ready answer for that. But the best source is a person on the ground at the place, rather than the information going from the ground to LATCO back to the aircraft, where it may get sanitised along the way.
But you would agree with me that the most obvious person who's providing the information from the ground is someone who's deployed by the New South Wales Rural Fire Service.
Yes.
The client.
So the operator is then soliciting the information from a local source, and that's a reasonable thing to do.
Yes, I'll move on. In paragraph 1.2.24, Mr. Polkinghorne, page 7 at the foot of the document, you note that put against the background of an expectation that the aviation assets will be able to be utilised and a strong financial incentive to use the assets, a very clear indication of unsafe conditions that could not be avoided would need to be evident before a decision to abort a firefighting decision would be made. Now, firstly, what evidence, if any, do you point to suggest that there was a strong financial incentive by Coulson for its contracted pilots to accept taskings?
I think at the organisational level, there's an expectation that pilots go flying. And I think this probably pervades into the culture of the organisation that, we have pilots that do stuff. From my experience in the industry, a pilot who won't deploy is fairly quickly redeployed to something different. So I think there's, in terms of the strong financial incentive, when these aircraft are tasked, they get the rate of income is very different from when they're sitting on the ground waiting.
Well, if you assume the correctness of the evidence of Sean Dugan, the captain of Bomber 137, that's the 737,
Yes.
that in his experience with Coulson Aviation, that if a task was rejected, there would be no ramifications, repercussions or consequences flowing from that task rejection, and that there was no pressure to fly. Does that alter your view that you've expressed?
No.
And why is that?
Well, I don't believe that in the long term that is a way the industry operates, and I think the culture of the industry is that we want people who can do in these sorts of tasks, in these sorts of jobs. So I alluded to the gap between becoming unsafe and keeping flying up until the point where you're keeping flying. So you want people that will come up some way towards the point of being unsafe in these in adverse weather conditions, and you can put it in terms of flying to a meteorological minima or weather minima. So, going into an airport, you'll have a weather minima that says it's 400 feet. So at 400 feet, if you can't see the runway, you're going around and you're going somewhere else, or you're doing another approach. So pilots are expected to fly to the actual minima, not put another 200 feet on top of the minima to say, oh well, it's a bit safer if I don't go right to the minima. Those sorts of pilots will suddenly find that they don't have a long-term future in the industry. So the expectation is pilots will fly to somewhere close to the limit.
But if you assume, as I commenced with my last question, that we have a pilot, very experienced pilot, who had done 7 years of aerial aviation work, says from his experience, if I reject a task, there's no ramifications and there was no pressure to fly. Now, if you just assume that, how can you express the opinion you've just expressed in relation to Coulson Aviation based on that assumption?
Well, I think it's probably written in their procedures that there is no pressure. There is probably no pressure immediately after someone rejects a task. There's probably a more cultural, covert type way of drafting out the pilots that readily reject a task to those that reject a task, although they'll take the task further than other pilots. So there is, pilots are supposed to be a homogenous group, but they're not. So some are going to be more risk averse than others, and some are going to reject earlier than others. And I'd suggest that if someone was to reject very early in when the risk was relatively low, those pilots would be drafted out of the industry fairly quickly.
And the answer that you've just given now and earlier answers, I should say, am I fair to put to you that that's an opinion that you've expressed not based on any industry experience, having not worked in the aerial firefighting space?
I think my industry experience says that is the case, because I know that in aerial spraying tasks it's a bit the same, in aerial mustering tasks it's a bit the same, in emergency recovery tasks it's much the same, in normal regular public transport flying it's much the same. So it pervades across the industry.
But you can't point to any specific evidence that relates to any unsafe practices by Coulson or its pilots in relation to the 2019-2020 bushfire season, correct?
I couldn't put my finger on any particular evidence there, no.
It's just an opinion that you have formulated based on your experience in relation to the agri-industry and perhaps also in relation to some commercial operations that you've been involved in.
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to consider the employment contracts of the aircrew on B134?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that they were on a salary?
Yes.
And that there does not appear to be any financial incentive contained within the terms of their contracts of employment to accept multiple taskings for financial reward?
I'm not a commercial lawyer, but I think there is some incentive provided when they go past 135 days of work, and that I was at a loss to work out what constituted the 135 days of work. So
thank you.
I don't really know whether the incentives are real or not.
Mr. Polgan, can I just move you into section 4 of your report to page 11? And we may have already covered this in our exchanges already. And it's really picking up what you have to say, paragraphs 4.1.6 to 4.1.9. I really want to explore with you about the shorter chain of communication. Does that not encompass what we were exchanging earlier in relation to having someone within the client, New South Wales RFS, providing that shorter communication with the LAT crew?
Well, as I expressed then, it's one way.
Well, I'm happy to receive your evidence in relation to other ways.
Well, I think I outlined the fact that the LATCO function may live with the operator as distinct from the Rural Fire Service.
Moving to page 12 to paragraph 4.2.2. Again, it's looking at improving communications. You say in the last sentence in that paragraph, Mr. Polkinghorn, the channels of communication are often circuitous in that they may go through several different individuals on their way to the final intended delivery point.
Yes.
In your opinion, how do you improve that system flaw? Could it be a LATCO having direct communication with a LAT crew?
Well, it depends where the LATCO who the LATCO belongs with, but yes.
Don't worry where the LATCO sits, but if the LATCO has got direct communication with relevant stakeholders, be it on the ground or elsewhere, in Bureau of Meteorology or wherever, and they're pulling that information together that they know may be relevant to a particular crew, air crew, would that answer your concerns that you've identified in 4.2.2?
In small part.
Right. And what's the small part?
But it would answer the one communication problem. But you've got multiple communication problems here because you've got multiple aircraft on the fire ground. You've got air attack supervisors. You've got seat aircraft. You've got helicopters there. Someone needs to have a picture of the entire fire area to work out the coordination of these aircraft. I mean,
So we're not at cross purposes. I'm just looking at large air tankers, not rotocraft or small fixed wing planes that may be providing aerial reconnaissance or air supervision, but just in relation to large air tankers.
Some of the action of large air tankers is very much influenced by the other aircraft on the fire ground. So someone has got to have a big picture of what the fire ground looks like if they're providing information to the LATs about operating in the area.
Thank you. So I want to deal with 5.1.3, if I may, please, Mr. Polkinghorne, where you express an opinion in relation to whether the operation needed aerial supervision to supervise the dropping of load should be one determined by the operator as distinct from the RFS. Now, by the operator, in the example we're dealing with today, are you referring to Coulson Aviation?
Yes.
And why do you say that that decision as to whether or not there be a bird dog, that rests with the operator, not with RFS?
So I see that as again, dividing the function between the client and the operator. So I think the function of the operator is to work out how they're going to do the job, and if a bird dog is there to do it, that will be an operator decision. I'd be more concerned about the other decision where the RFS said, well, you don't need a bird dog to do this one, and the operator felt some obligation to continue.
Why does it matter, so far as you're concerned, as to whether that decision rests with one or the other?
Because one clearly has the chance to start, continue, or stop the operation.
Pausing there, doesn't that rest with the pilot ultimately?
Ultimately, it rests with the pilot, but it needs to be through the operator.
Why? Why does it matter whether it's through the operator or through RFS if the ultimate decision making rests with the pilot in command of, in this case, the bird dog?
Well, the operator, the pilot in command is going there with that background that we talked about earlier of the expectation that the job will get delivered. And if they, there's an expectation they'll deliver the job, so they are there to deliver the job, and there's a strong financial incentive for them to do so from the operator perspective. Notwithstanding
that ultimately it's the individual pilot who's going to have to make the decision whether they fly or not.
Yes, that's right.
Well, I want to suggest to you that in the example that we're dealing with now, that it doesn't matter at all who makes that decision in circumstances where the ultimate decision to fly or not rests with the pilot in command.
Just repeat the question.
I'm just wanting to put to you fairly that at the end of the day, it just doesn't matter who makes the decision as to whether or not there be a bird dog present, because ultimately it's the bird dog pilot who decides whether they'll go or not.
The bird dog pilot or the pilot of the LAT?
Well, in this case, we're dealing with the bird dog.
Well, I think the LAT pilot, has an option of saying, well, we don't need a bird dog.
Well,
but I don't think if the RFS send a bird dog, there's probably a bit more covert pressure or overt pressure on the pilot to deliver the job if the bird dog pilot says, yeah, it's all good to go.
Well, as you know, in the particular case that Coroners dealing with, a bird dog was sought to be tasked and rejected the tasking because, in the opinion of that particular pilot, Mr. Husto Coward, the conditions were unfavourable for flying, based on a previous experience he'd had 2 weeks earlier in that general area where he was to be tasked to, and also in circumstances where the other 2 planes, being faster planes, were ahead of him and he may not have got there in time in any event to lead them in.
Yeah, so I understood that the Bird Dog pilot rejected the task based at Adaminaby.
That's so?
Yeah.
Right. Your Honour, that concludes the examination.
Mr. Free.
Your Honour, I've spoken to Mr. Amani and we've decided Mr. Amani might go first. It may be more efficient.
Thank you, Your Honour. Mr. Polkinghorne, you have 0 experience of aerial firefighting, correct?
I've not sat in an aeroplane aerial firefighting, that's correct.
I just want to make sure there's no doubt about this. You've got no experience of aerial firefighting in the air,
That's right.
and you've got no experience of aerial firefighting on the ground.
You could say that.
Well, I want to hear what you have to say on the topic. Am I right in thinking you've got no experience of aerial firefighting within any decision-making desk, i.e. at the RFS or any like?
I've got
Fire authority.
no dynamic experience, so no day-to-day operations of an air desk, that's right.
By dynamic experience, you mean any experience at all?
No, I've spent a number of years contracted to the Department of Fire and Emergency Services in WA, and I've in the past done some work for the Rural Fire Service, but a long time ago in terms of contracts and designing some of the contracts in the early part.
But to be clear, you've never sat on a desk during a fire
that's
emergency
right.
situation with any decision maker, correct?
That's right.
And you've never been involved in the field during any fire emergency situation in a way that is targeted towards suppressing a fire, correct?
That's correct.
You do have some experience with crop dusting, that's right?
Yes.
And you've got some experience with mustering, correct?
Yes.
Is that cattle mustering?
Yes.
And that's using, just in your own words, explain to Her Honour what that involves. But am I right in thinking, broadly speaking, we're talking about a small aircraft
Yes.
flying at low altitude to move cattle around?
Yes.
You'd agree with me, sir, that's far removed from what brings us here.
It's different.
Well, you don't agree with me that it's very different?
You're working in a hazard-rich environment. You're working in often windy and turbulent conditions. You're working at the limits of the aircraft.
So the reality is there's an extraordinary difference between small aircraft mobilising cattle and large aircraft flying at very low altitude to drop retardant in an emergency dynamic operating environment, correct?
It's different, yes.
You were asked some questions by counsel assisting about whether it might have assisted on the day in question, or generally speaking, for pilots to be armed before taking off with information about whether other pilots in the area were rejecting flights, and if so, why? Do you remember being asked those questions? Yes. And I think in answer to one of them, you indicated that you'd read some of the evidence that has fallen before Her Honour. Is that right?
Yes.
Have you read all of it?
I haven't read the 1,000+ pages of every page of it, no.
That's something we've got to look forward to. But am I right in thinking you've certainly read the evidence of Mr. Dugan?
Yes.
And you would have gleaned from that pretty clearly that he brought to bear to that evidence 10 years of experience fighting fires, maybe hundreds of fires across at least 14 states of the United States.
Yes.
That he'd also fought fires internationally, including here.
Yes.
And he said to Her Honour that there was nothing from his point of view more critical to his ability to assess the dangers associated with a particular flight than knowledge about what others were doing in the field on a given day. He gave evidence to that effect.
Yes.
You're not in any position to criticise or counter that evidence, correct?
I don't think I'm in a position to criticise that evidence, but I mean, there's a whole raft of factors which will influence a particular pilot on a particular day.
No, but you're not in any position to say to Her Honour that viewpoint, that view of the world in terms of what information matters pre-flight is incorrect, are you?
Well, I don't know whether it's correct or incorrect. I mean, it's his opinion. So that's his opinion's a fine thing, but, whether it's correct or not is he thinks it's correct. I may not necessarily agree with him.
That's what I want to explore. You're here today as an expert. You've heard what his opinion is. You've heard what underpins it. And I'm suggesting to you politely, respectfully, that you're in no position to question it. What do you say to that?
Well, there are aspects of it I don't particularly agree with.
You would have seen the evidence of Mr. Justo Coward, correct?
Yes.
You would have seen that he brought to bear 30 years of experience in fighting maybe thousands of fires to that evidence, correct?
Yes.
And you would have seen that he indicated that knowing what local air assets were doing, he gave evidence to the effect that that would have been a critical piece of the risk calculus before taking off
Yes.
on a given day. You saw that?
Yes.
You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Would you agree with me that at the heart of your report are a raft of conclusions about culture?
Yes.
You've made conclusions about culture within the broad organisation of stakeholders that come together to fight fires in New South Wales, correct?
Yes.
You've made conclusions about culture within the operator, correct?
Yes.
You've made conclusions about culture within the RFS, correct?
Yes.
And you've certainly made conclusions about the culture that applies when those two entities interact with one another, correct?
Yes.
You'd agree with me that when one talks about culture in a space like this, one is talking about the way in which humans interact?
Yes.
You would agree with me that one is also talking about the way relationships are forged and the driver of those relationships, correct?
Yes.
And the way individuals conduct themselves in the context of those relationships, correct?
Yes.
How many RFS personnel have you interacted with for the purposes of completing your report?
None.
Not one.
Oh, in between the time that I was briefed on this and between the time that I wrote this, none.
Just out of interest, those two timeframes, what was the time lag between briefing and completion?
About 6 days.
6 days?
Yes.
And during that window of opportunity, you didn't speak to a single RFS personnel?
Not that I can recall.
Can I take it that the same answer applies to Coulson personnel? You didn't speak to any pilots at Coulson?
No.
You didn't speak to any crew at Coulson? And you certainly didn't speak to any stakeholders in terms of the corporate structure either here or in the United States, correct?
That's right.
You didn't speak to any other operators in the field in New South Wales or in any field, correct?
I have a lot of background knowledge of the industry and certainly had in that 6 days had significant interaction with the Department of Foreign Emergency Services in WA. I have a good knowledge of the well, perhaps a little dated information about Coulson, having met Wayne Coulson some years ago. I've looked pretty carefully at the prior to the introduction of large air tankers in New South Wales, at some of the rural fire service actions, and certainly the same in WA. I'm familiar with the operators in the industry. I personally know a number of the key individuals of the operators around Australia and some internationally. So it's not, my opinions are not born from an empty vessel.
Have you finished that answer? I'll ask the question again. Am I right in thinking that in the 6 days that you applied your mind to the task at hand. You didn't interact with any operator in the context of aerial firefighting operations, correct?
Yes.
It's fair to say that in the context of those 6 days of work, you didn't look at the contracts that existed between the individual pilots.
I object to that question.
Yeah.
It's unfair.
Okay.
You know that. It didn't happen. And I got them on Monday.
I withdraw that question. Can I explore with you this? The upshot of your cultural analysis in terms of the conclusions you arrive at is, you tell me if you agree with it, a broad concern on your part that one way or another, the way in which these entities interact or the way in which the machinations within one or both of them play out results in a scenario where financial incentives are prioritised above safety outcomes.
Just run that again.
Am I right in summarising your cultural findings in this way, that you arrive at a concern that in effect financial incentives are placed above safety outcomes?
I don't think that's the sentiment at all. I think nobody wants to be unsafe, and you know, in the industry, from time to time, things are unsafe. That's why we have accidents.
Well, to quote you earlier today, and I apologise, sir, I don't have the benefit of a live transcript, but my note is you said earlier today there's a strong cultural feeling that when there's a fire, they, and I think you were talking about pilots, should be deployed. Do you remember giving that evidence?
Aircraft should be deployed, yes.
And you said, and by the way, when you say that, there's a strong cultural feeling, whose feeling?
Both the contractor and the agency.
And you said that there are strong cultural factors built into the pilots that they need to go flying when there's an emergency on, correct? Yes. Isn't really what you're trying to say that there are concerns of a cultural kind that result in safety outcomes being second fiddle to financial or other incentives?
Well, they might safety outcome. I mean, nobody plans to have an accident. It's just how big the margin is between, you know, as I said earlier, the accident point and where you're operating.
Well, sir, you've been asked about this, but briefly, Mr. Dugan gave evidence to the effect that across a body of work at Coulson, he's never felt any pressure at all to accept a task when safety dictates point in a different direction. You saw his evidence in that respect, didn't you?
Yes.
And you saw his evidence about the safety culture at Coulson generally being consistent with his experience, correct?
Yes.
You were asked by counsel assisting whether that in any way changed your views, correct?
Yes.
And you said no.
Well, it didn't change my view. I mean, Coulson have had, I mean, the only two large air tankers that have crashed in Australia belong with Coulson.
The fact is, sir, is it not, that you said no to whether or not that information from Mr. Dugan in any way affected your views?
Yeah, I said it didn't affect my views.
And I want to suggest to you, sir, there's no better person to ask in terms of the safety culture in an organisation than a person who is within it, who's experiencing it day in, day out. Would you agree with that?
No.
You've read the evidence of
Yes.
Mr. Justo Coward, and you know, don't you, that Mr. Justo Coward rejected a task on the relevant day?
Yes.
And you know, don't you, that it was in the context of that rejection that he gave some evidence that, to the effect that there was no pushback in that regard, correct? Does that in any way inform the views you've expressed about there being some culture to get up in the air when it's not safe to do so?
I think the best person to judge the culture of an organisation is someone from outside the organisation who's looking in. And you know, I've known many organisations who say they have an excellent safety culture, but when they are looked at by an external person, looking at the safety culture, you'll find points that don't necessarily support a strong safety culture.
So I accept that, but so you haven't done that work, have you? You haven't interacted with anyone within the organisation about the safety culture?
Not in the last 6 days, no.
And you know that RFS witness after RFS witness has come before Her Honour and indicated that they defer to the pilots, A, and B, they don't put pressure on pilots to get up in the air if pilots don't feel comfortable doing so, correct?
Yes.
You're in no position to counter any of that evidence, are you?
I don't know why I wouldn't be.
Well, you're not suggesting that that evidence wasn't given honestly to the best of those witnesses' ability?
Well, it's what they believe.
And it speaks to, does it not, a culture that emphasises above all else safety?
Because people believe they've got a good safety culture doesn't mean they necessarily have.
You asked some questions about whether or not it might be useful to have LATCOs or operators present at decision-making desks within the RFS or the relevant fire authority. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I think, did you give evidence to the effect you weren't sure that would be a good idea?
Yes.
You would agree, I think, having read the evidence, that one of the learnings to emerge from this process is the need to ensure much stronger information flows about conditions on the ground, correct?
The information from the ground is useful, yes.
You've given evidence to the effect that ultimately it's the pilots that have responsibility for the safety of a given flight, correct? Yes. You know that their ability to do that really turns on the information they have available to them, correct?
There are situations where a pilot will make decisions based on the conditions that they're experiencing in a particular phase of flight. And they have some ability to look at what they're seeing outside, like which way the wind's blowing, and make some decisions based on what they actually see. And I think there's quite a lot of these pilots will probably make decisions about where they might particularly fly based on, the relative wind to a hill or something like that. So they might choose to fly in wind conditions on one side of the hill that they wouldn't go to the other side of the hill, from knowing very well what the physical conditions of the air would be like on the downwind side. So there's information from the ground is useful, but there would be a bunch of pilots in this space who look out the window and they make some decisions based on what they're seeing in the space.
You know that multiple pilots have come before Her Honour and given evidence that they were in the dark on the relevant day about information that they would have appreciated having.
Sorry?
You know that multiple pilots have indicated to Her Honour that they didn't have information that they would like to have had on the relevant day. Information about what other operators, what other assets were doing in the field at the relevant time.
Look, I can't answer that.
Well, sir, I just want to suggest to you that any mechanism, including operators having a presence at an RFS desk that better ensures stronger information flows between stakeholders, must be a good outcome. What do you say to that?
I think, yeah, it's an outcome, but I mean, is it going to fix the problem? I don't know.
Well, it's better than doing nothing, isn't it, Mr. Polkinghorn? If there's a problem in terms of communication flows, having an operator's staff member at an RFS desk might, one way or another, result in information flowing a little more freely. You'd have to accept that, sir. It's a matter of logic.
Well, I think it's the value of the information that's flowing. I mean, there's lots of information out there, and there's obviously lots of information already flowing, but is it good information? And you know, the good information is that, I mean, I use the analogy of the gems among the gravel, and there are a few gems, and there's a lot of gravel.
Well, just a couple of other topics to explore with you quickly. You at part 6 of your report, you explore various provisions of the contractual arrangements at play here. Do you remember doing that?
Yes.
You cite various contractual clauses from 6.2.1 and following. You see that? And you say, do you, that various of those contractual clauses give rise to the concern that you have as to culture?
They build the culture, yes.
But ultimately, they all bow down, don't they, to the clause that you reference in 6.2.8. That's section 5.9. The pilot in command has final authority to determine whether the flight can be accomplished safely.
Yes.
You've got no information to point or honour to suggest that pilots within Coulson don't go about that task to the best of their ability, foregrounding safety at every turn, correct?
I mean, as I said earlier, no pilot plans to have an accident.
You gave some evidence earlier about political noise and political expediency. Do you remember giving that evidence?
Yes.
You haven't interacted with any political stakeholders in this space across the 6-day journey of you putting that report together, correct?
No, that was based on the information that's in the NAFC website.
And you've got no reason for suggesting to Her Honour that in any way political noise or expediency informs the decision-making processes of pilots, whether in the air or on the ground, correct?
Sorry?
You've got no reason or basis for suggesting to Her Honour that political noise or expediency in any way affects the decision-making of pilots, whether in the air or on the ground.
I think it's a cultural influence in the industry.
Once again, you defer to the idea of a cultural influence or driver, that's right.
Yes.
So I want to suggest to you, out of fairness, courtesy of submissions that will be made, that really when you speak of culture within this space, you are speculating. You are engaging in a process of speculation without any clear evidence to support the views you express. What do you say to that?
I disagree with your notion.
And I want to suggest to you that what you're doing is calling into question the drivers of people at the RFS and Coulson end in circumstances where you've simply got no basis for so doing.
I don't think your suggestion is correct.
No further questions. Thank you.
I note the time.
Your Honour, if it assists at all, I've got only 2 short questions, and I understand my learned friend for the ATSB has very little to ask.
I have maybe 1 or 2 questions.
I mean, Your Honour's hands, of course, but
No, we'll go ahead. Mr McDermott.
Thank you.
Mr. McDermott.
I'm happy to go now, Your Honour, if that's... Thank you. Mr Polkinghorn, my name's Mr Free. I appear for the RFS. Just a couple of quick questions I want to ask you. On that topic of the evidence you gave about these being highly visible assets and an expectation builds that aircraft will be deployed, I take it you can't point to any particular examples of deployments of LATs where it was firstly ineffective to deploy the LAT?
Ineffective to deploy the LAT.
Yes.
I can't point to a particular day and a particular instance where it was ineffective.
Thank you.
There are obviously ranges of success on ranges of missions.
Indeed. And nor can you point to any examples of where a LAT was deployed despite it being unsafe to do so.
I can't comment on each particular mission and its relative safety. No.
Thank you. Mr. Polkinghorne, you give some evidence in your report about pilots having to deal with multiple communication channels, might be VHF, UHF, sometimes mobile phone communications, for example. I take it that's one of the technical challenges, but a skill that pilots develop is being able to maintain communications on multiple channels.
There are some practitioners in the industry who've spoken to me about the number of radios that need to be monitored, the amount of noise that just radio noise that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. It is freely acknowledged in the industry as one of the challenges of conducting firefighting operations, and I base this on information from operators of single engineer tankers who, in a single pilot environment, choose to turn some down or manage their radios by not listening to everything, and obviously some information gets lost in the amount of radio noise. They're monitoring up to 4 radios quite a lot of the time. It's certainly in WA operations that I've been dealing with in the last few weeks, it is communications is a major issue.
And one of the reasons that's a challenge in an emergency environment is that it's a dynamic environment and the sources of information might come from various people on the ground or in the air using different modes of communication.
That's right.
And to a large extent, that just is an inevitable product of that kind of environment.
Whether it's an inevitable product is a moot point, I guess, but it's developed in a way that the radio chatter is a big deal in the management of the aircraft and the operation.
I understand. If I could just take up your analogy about the gems and the gravel, which is a useful way of understanding the priorities. Is it your evidence that the pilot, as the expert aviator, is the one best placed to understand which are the gems and which are the gravel?
Yes.
So one takes guidance from pilots as to what information they are best assisted by and how to convey it to them?
Yes, that's probably a reasonable way to source what's useful to them.
Okay.
And I mean, it will vary between individual pilots about what information they particularly want as well.
Yes, so you take the lead from them in terms of what they're indicating they're best assisted by.
Yes.
And aviation specialists are themselves best placed to understand those needs and to discuss them with pilots.
Yes.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honour. Thank you, Mr. Polkinghorne.
Mr. Polkinghorne, my name is McDermott. I represent the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, the ATSB.
Yep.
I just had a couple of questions about some of your answers with question 5 in your report. At page 2351, do you have that there?
2351,
the red in the bottom right.
Yeah.
You've identified, you're responding to the questions at question 5, A, B and C. And at 5.1.1, do you have that there?
5.1.1, yes.
Yes, you say that the ATSB, in dealing with the issues at A and B, do not appear to acknowledge the objects of the RFS Act or those specific provisions of the Civil Aviation Safety Regulations.
Yes.
Yes. You're not, by that paragraph, suggesting that the recommendations in A and B are somehow unlawful or not supported by the Act or the regulations?
considering they're unlawful.
You're really just saying that you perceive a tension between what you've evaluated in those two pieces of law with how you think the system ought to operate, having regard to who.
Well, I don't believe that the RFS has a responsibility to provide the operational information to pilots
Based on
on a general basis.
On a general basis, but you also anchor that in your interpretation of the objects of the RFS legislation.
Yes.
Right. I have no further questions for the witness.
Anything?
Nothing arising, thank you, Your Honour.
That's the extra evidence. Thank you, Mr. Polk.
Thank you.
Just before Your Honour rises, I think there's no more witnesses for the day, but can I just take the opportunity in the public forum to raise a concern about an ABC News report of some of yesterday's evidence? I'm not asking Your Honour to do anything specific about it, and my client, the RFS, will be in contact with the ABC, but just want to raise in this forum and for the benefit of those listening, there is a report suggesting that Mr Harder's evidence yesterday was to the effect that he had amended his log and changed a document. That was, of course, not suggested. It was not the effect of his evidence. It wasn't put to him by counsel assisting or any other barrister. So my client, as I said, has been in contact with the ABC. There may well be a correction that follows, but I did just want to raise that publicly.
Thank you, Mr. Frey, for raising.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Your Honour, Mr Free is correct. That concludes the evidence today. Your Honour is not sitting tomorrow. On Monday, the 27th of March, I intend to call Mr John Gallagher of Coulson Aviation first via AVL. Mr Gallagher, of course, being overseas, followed by Peter McKegney, who's a Deputy Commissioner of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. That will then conclude the formal evidence, followed then by family statements, Your Honour.
Thanks very much, Mr. Castleton. Thank you, family. We'll adjourn now. Excuse me. Resume. Excuse me. 10 a.m. on Monday. Silence.